So, in the first module, we got from anarchy to a centralized state. And that centralized state delivered quite a lot of economic development, but it's really not a nice place for an ordinary person to live. It doesn't deliver benefits for the ordinary person. It's certainly not meant to. It's meant to deliver resources to the thug, which he uses on military spending primarily, the odd palace or two thrown in along the way, no doubt. To the extent that he shares power with the wealthy, out of necessity in order to borrow, then a lot of other people benefit the rich. But ordinary people are really not on the menu of benefits in that centralized state. What we're now going to look at in this module is moving from that sort of state to a state in which ordinary people get a lot better off. I've got to call that an inclusive state. So it's centralized and it's inclusive. Now, there are two really famous, brilliant contributions, academic contributions here, both of which look at that passage to an inclusive state. They mean slightly different things. And so we're going to bring that out before we get going. Probably the best known, because it's a nice, easy read book, which I recommend, is Acemoglu and Robinson. And they have a concept of the inclusive state, which is basically the passage to democracy. So the state, the centralized state, becomes inclusive because power, political power, shifts from the thug, not just to the wealthy, but to everybody. Everybody ends up powerful because they have a vote. So that passage from thug dictatorship to democracy is the Acemoglu and Robinson account of the move to an inclusive state. The state can't help but work for ordinary people because the people taking the decisions in the state are pinioned to the interests of ordinary people, because if they don't do what ordinary people want, they get voted out. So that's the Acemoglu and Robinson account. It's not the only account. The other major account of the move from a centralized state to a state that works for ordinary people is by Besley and Persson. And Besley and Persson have a different language. It's a slightly confusing language. Where they're going to end up is a state they call a common interest state. And the place where they start with the thug, they call a redistributive state. I think redistributive state's a little bit confusing because we tend to think of that as a welfare state. And the Besley and Persson redistributive state is anything but a welfare state. It's a redistribution from ordinary people to the thug. Besley and Persson start from the thug, as do Acemoglu and Robinson. But where they end up, the common interest state, may be a democracy, but doesn't have to be. And so here's a subtle difference that turns out to have a very big practical difference. So Besley and Persson say, what is a common interest state? It's a state where the people in power have their own interest is broadly coincident with the interests of ordinary people. Now, indeed, one reason why it might be broadly coincident is that it's a democracy, they've no choice. If they do anything else, they'll vote it out of power. But it doesn't have to be democracy. It could be that the elite in power is strongly in power, but happens to have interests given the structure of opportunities in the society, happens to have interests that broadly coincide with the interests of ordinary people. And so it does, in its own interest, things that work for the common interest. Now that difference might sound very esoteric. Where the rubber hits the road is one state that really is quite important, and that's called China. So Acemoglu and Robinson famously predict China is not going to make it from the sort of lower middle income level it's got now up to a developed state, because it's not a democracy. And Besley and Persson don't really have that same prediction, that it's, for them, China is a common interest state, because the interest of the ruling elite, whilst not perfectly coincident with ordinary people, is sufficiently coincident given certain structural opportunities in China. So it's a distinction that has a very big practical difference of application. For our purposes, either of these states will cut the mustard. They'll do the job. Because what we're trying to understand in the end is under what circumstances do we get a centralized state that works for ordinary people in the sense of spreading economic benefits pretty broadly. And so both the Acemoglu and Robinson version, democracy, and the broader Besley and Persson version, the common interest state, will do. So we'll use them in effect interchangeably.